Hello, my name is Travis Daniels.
My name is James Stiles, and today in our episode, Bracelets, Buttons, and Bombing Runs, the story of a Vietnam prisoner of war, we will talk about two interesting artifacts, a Vietnam prisoner of war bracelet and Vietnam War buttons. In the early stages of the Vietnam War, there was broad public support in the United States for containing the spread of communism and supporting the South Vietnamese government. This support was influenced by Cold War ideology and fears of the domino theory. Many Americans initially believed that the war could be won quickly and decisively, mirroring the success of previous conflicts like World War II. As U.S. involvement in Vietnam deepened, doubts about the war's purpose began to emerge. The media coverage of the conflict, like television footage showing the brutality and suffering, started to erode public confidence in the government's handling of the war. The escalation of the war led to increased protest and dissent, particularly among young people and college students. Rising casualty numbers, including the drafting of young men to military service, increased the opposition to the war. The idea that the war was unwinnable and our reasons for being there were unjust became common opinion. President Richard Nixon's policy of Vietnamization, which aimed to gradually transfer combat responsibilities to South Vietnamese forces while withdrawing U.S. troops, was met with skepticism by many Americans. Critics argued that the strategy for disengagement rather than genuine effort to end the war. The Kent State Massacre was the killing of 4 students by National Guard troops during the protest at Kent State University in 1970. It shocked the nation and intensified anti-war sentiment.
The images of the chaotic evacuation of U.S. personnel and South Vietnamese allies as North Vietnamese forces captured Saigon in 1975 was a humiliating end to the war and caused even more negative thoughts about the U.S. involvement in Vietnam. In the war's aftermath, there was a period of reassessment of U.S. foreign policy. The Vietnam War came to be seen as a costly and unnecessary effort that cost the lives of many and helped few.
In Vietnam, buttons and bracelets have been used as subtle forms of protest to express dissonance and raise awareness about social and political issues. These items can carry significant messages, often in symbolic or coded forms, enabling people to communicate their views without attracting excessive attention from authorities or risking severe repercussions.
For example, during which periods of political unrest or when strict censorship is in place, buttons and bracelets with specific symbols, colors, or slogans have been used to demonstrate solidarity, raise awareness, or support a cause. They serve as discrete signals among people who share common beliefs or stand against oppressive practices.
These wearable symbols are valuable tools for peaceful protest, allowing individuals to express their opinions and connect with like-minded individuals in a low-key, non-confrontational manner. By using everyday items like buttons and bracelets, protesters can maintain a sense of unity and purpose while avoiding direct confrontation. As the Vietnam War raged on into the 1970s, the North Vietnamese had captured hundreds of American soldiers and airmen, with many more reported as missing in action. A young college student took it upon herself to make sure Americans did not forget about them. Carol Bates Brown formed Voices Vital in America in 1970. The organization produced and distributed roughly 5 million prisoner of war and missing in action bracelets throughout the Vietnam War. Each bracelet bore the name of a prisoner of war or serviceman missing in action. More than 3,500 service members in Vietnam became prisoners of war or were missing in action, and her organization issued bracelets for 1,300 of them. Our prisoner of war bracelet artifact had the name of Robert Biss, an Air Force pilot who was a prisoner of war during the Vietnam War. Later in his life, Robert Biss would be given this artifact. The 3 buttons we were given all spread a similar message discussing prisoners of war and those missing in action. From left to right, we have prisoners of war never have nice days, which uses its illustration to get its message across. Missing in Action, Only Hanoi Knows uses a patriotic symbol of the American flag in its message. And finally, Welcome Home, Prisoners of War, button that was used to celebrate the return of those lost during the Vietnam War.
Robert Biss was born in Johnstown, Pennsylvania in 1939. He always had an interest with flying, reading comics about American fighter pilots while growing up. He would join the Air Force in 1959, and after serving time as a navigator, Robert earned his flight wings in 1964. He would begin to fly F-4 Phantoms from January 1965 until he was shot down and forced to eject over North Vietnam in November 1966. Almost immediately after hitting the ground, Captain Biss was immediately taken into custody by the North Vietnamese. They placed him in solitary confinement for about a week, where he would be subjugated to mock execution several times a day and was physically beaten by his guards regularly. He then traveled by boat, marching and riding in the back of trucks for 38 days from his first prison camp all the way to Hanoi. In Hanoi, Robert was kept isolated from the rest of his fellow captives. He was routinely tortured, interrogated for information, and forced to listen to anti-American propaganda until eventually the North Vietnamese realized that any information Captain Biss might have had was irrelevant. After several years in isolation, Robert and the other prisoners were allowed to live amongst each other. They often held skits about famous American television and read from the Bible to pass the time. It wasn't until 1970 that the first radio message was received from Robert telling his family that he was captured and was doing okay as a prisoner. During this time, Robert's family held on to hope that he was still alive throughout the war. Captain Biss would finally be released from captivity and return home in March of 1973, almost 3 years after that first radio message. Robert stayed in the Air Force and would retire as a lieutenant colonel in 1979. Following his release, Robert Biss would be the guest speaker at multiple events to talk about POWs, among many other things. He was then gifted this bracelet, inscribed with his name and the date of when he was shot down over Vietnam, being November 11th, 1966.
This concludes our episode, Bracelets, Buttons, and Bombing Runs, the story of a Vietnam prisoner of war. We hope that you enjoyed your time with us and that you learned a thing or two about this small portion of the larger history of the Vietnam War.